Hello and welcome to the Culture Connection Speaker Series. I'm Michael Beckelheimer in Washington, D.C., and I'm talking with American professors of Russian studies about their insights into Russian culture and how they teach it in American colleges and universities. This program is presented by the American Center of Moscow, which is supported by the American Embassy in Moscow. And if you're watching on the American Center's YouTube, VK, or Telegram channels, please post your comments and questions at any time. We'll keep an eye on them and we'll answer them throughout the show. For Russian subtitles, you can select closed captioning in Russian. So today we're talking to Marcus Levitt, a leading scholar of Russian literature in the US and a professor for 32 years at the University of Southern California in LA. He has spent several years living and doing research in Russia and the former Soviet Union. A few highlights from his biography, which we'll touch on in our discussion today. His first book, Russian Literary Politics and the Pushkin Celebration of 1880, considered the cultural context for Alexander Pushkin's elevation to the rank of national poet. He also led an expedition of students from the University of Southern California to Transbaikal Siberia to record music of the Timaysky Old Believers. And he's presently taking part in a collaborative effort with several Russian scholars to create a critical edition of the works of Alexander Sumarokov, a major but largely forgotten 18th century Russian literary figure. So he's been working on Sumarokov's large-scale works for the Russian imperial court, including the first ballet and opera librettos in Russian. We'll get to that in a little bit. Marcus, we're so glad you're here. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
So I do want to say, Marcus, on a personal note, if I may, I want to say how much I appreciate your work personally. 10 years ago, when I was making my documentary film on Pushkin, your book, Russian Literary Politics and the Pushkin Celebration of 1880, it really inspired me. It inspired me to focus on how Pushkin became Russia's national poet. And it turns out that my film, which originally was about Pushkin, really became about Russia and how Russians elevated Pushkin to this status of national poet. So thank you for helping me and being a part of that film. And I'm really glad to talk to you today about Pushkin and other things. But let's start with your early years, your early path to Russian literature. What got you interested?
Well, that's a big question. I think it has many answers. Well, apart from my early education and my love for reading, which I think was very important, I guess I caught the Russian bug during college. I visited the Soviet Union back in 1974, and just went on from there. I became a Russian major in college, Russian and history, and then applied to graduate school and just kept going. I mean, there are so many things that goes into one's choice of a career. It's really hard to say just one thing. But certainly the literature and the language were very big attractions. I still enjoy the Russian language. Russian literature is endlessly fascinating.
And on that, so when you were at graduate school, your dissertation and then your first book were both about Pushkin.
Right.
So, often I talk to professors and scholars who about one topic, but they actually studied something else in graduate. So today we're talking about what you really started out in your your academic career researching. Right. What brought you to Pushkin at that early stage in your academic development?
I was interested in the history of Russian criticism, and Pushkin was such a catalyzing figure in the 19th century. So that was my broader interest. When I came to look at Pushkin and criticism, the Pushkin celebration of 1880 was just a convenient kind of point to look at the whole tradition itself as the culmination of earlier of earlier problems and issues in Russian culture. I was interested in not just the criticism per se and what the arguments were, but the institutional and human, cultural, sociological factors that made Pushkin such an interesting character and such someone to be debated and discussed. So not so much Pushkin as a writer, although I love Pushkin as a writer, and I've written about Pushkin as a writer, but this was more, the national poet figure, which is really a kind of a social construct. It doesn't really tell you that much about Pushkin as a writer, other than how beloved he is by Russians.
So when you were studying and researching in the Soviet Union, I assume Moscow, in 1980, what was the environment like? What was the environment there like for studying Pushkin? Was he a sort of a safe figure because it was Pushkin? So to have an American studying Pushkin there, what was the environment like for you?
Well, two different questions: the general environment and Pushkin. The general environment was pretty bleak. That was the time of the evil empire and solidarity in Poland. Things were really on edge politically. I felt like I would just kind of do my work and keep my head down for various reasons. I really spent all the time I could in the archives or in the library, poring through old newspapers. As far as Pushkin, Pushkin's image at being safe, I think that was true for Russian scholars as well. That is, they could look to the classics, and especially to Pushkin, as a kind of refuge from the Soviet world, from propaganda, from politics, right? The political demand that one say certain things about writers. One thing that Pushkin, as a writer, exudes is this sense of freedom and independence, and certainly that comes out very strongly in a lot of his writings, and I think it's very appealing. So Pushkin as a kind of a safe haven from the external world.
Yeah,
As I think that's true for Russians as well as everybody else who reads Pushkin.
Sure. I remember speaking to one Russian scholar in St. Petersburg saying the same thing, how, the world outside is crazy and hectic and sometimes not pretty, but she can go into this world of Pushkin and sort of be protected from
right.
that. It's a sort of safe haven, as you say.
It reminds me of the end of the Pushkin speech by Dostoevsky, which is probably the most important document for the elevation of Pushkin into the national poet, when he said, Russian culture must, and Russia in general might have so many problems and issues, but at least we have Pushkin. We can point to him as something very valuable. Again, for him, that was existential kind of a point of view.
Exactly.
He looked at Pushkin as kind of the savior, not only of Russia, but of mankind in a certain sense.
Right. At least we have Pushkin.
At least we have Pushkin.
What did your fellow Russian colleagues in the early 1980s, what was their reaction to having a young American scholar there sort of investigating Pushkin and his role in Russian society?
I doubt if many people gave it a thought. I mean, I was just this unknown person sitting in the archives and in the libraries. It wasn't the days when you'd be invited to give a talk at the institute,
right,
or appear on TV or whatever. It just wasn't. That wasn't really part of the experience at that point, at least for me. It was not until the 1990s, that I started to take a very active role with Russian scholars, inviting them to take part in projects I was working on, traveling to Russia more often, taking part in conferences together, publishing things together. Right, the world changed so suddenly in the 1990s. But as a graduate student, I think it was mostly, as I said, keeping my head down and feeling privileged to be there working and to doing this interesting material. So I was basically not even really assimilating the material so much as getting it down, writing it down, collecting it, creating what was going to be the dissertation and the book.
Right. Did you know that you were going to write well, I guess you knew what your dissertation was about, but had you seen, what did you discover about the Pushkin celebration at that time? Like, what was new and useful from your time in Moscow doing that research that you didn't expect to find when you were back in LA?
Well, there was quite a lot. I would say one of the main things was the political context.
Uh-huh.
The late 70s and that period, the People's Will, right? The revolutionary group had put a fatwa out on the Tsar. That is, they were continual attempts to assassinate the Emperor Alexander.
Mm-hmm.
And the period of the Pushkin celebration took place in what's called the Loris Melikov honeymoon. Right, he was the new minister, and there was kind of a truce between the government, or between the state and the revolutionaries. So it was kind of a special period in which the war between society and the state was called off for a moment. Mm-hmm. So Pushkin became kind of a symbol of the public sphere, a symbol of, the fact that the whole celebration was private. It wasn't state-sponsored, which was very rare in 19th century Russian culture. So it felt like Russian society was having its say, was declaring Pushkin valuable, our national poet, celebrating Pushkin, making up for some of the attacks on Pushkin, right, by the revolutionaries in the 1860s, right, the famous debates over Pushkin. Right, and Pushkin's reputation had suffered greatly after his death for various reasons, in part censorship, the fact that some of his greatest works weren't known, but also a kind of reaction on the part of the revolutionary movement against aristocratic culture, against aristocratic writers like Pushkin. Attack on aesthetics in favor of pragmatics and some more socially conscious literature that had been growing at the time of the emancipation and the great reforms. It seems like Pushkin was already, someone from the past.
So let's talk about that period before the celebration and the unveiling of the monument even occurred,
right,
when there was this need and this debate about who would be Russia's national poet. So talk to us about this whole concept of a national poet. Why did Russians need to have one? And what did it mean?
Also, big question. One of the factors in the debate, at least in the 60s, was, what is a national poet? Does it mean simply a poet that reflects the nation and national values as an individual? Or was it a poet who reflects the people, the nation, narodny versus nationalny? Mm-hmm. And many came to the conclusion that, Pushkin, however great he was, whatever kind of a wonderful genius he was, is basically unknown to the people. So for them, Pushkin was kind of irrelevant to the needs of the people. That's one answer.
Was Pushkin unknown because people, the majority of Russians couldn't read, and so they weren't reading Pushkin, or he hadn't been published?
Yeah, you're right. Russia was still largely illiterate, right, and remained so for most of the 19th century. One of the important institutional cultural factors that led to Pushkin's canonization, we might say, as national poet, was the end of the copyright on his works. That was in 1887, a few years after the celebration. But there was an absolute explosion of publishing Pushkin in the later 19th century. So print capitalism, as Benedict Anderson calls it, right, is very important in creating the sense of what a nation is, national identity. So Pushkin became the focal point for this sense of Russianness, what it is to be Russian.
So then, go back then to the debates surrounding who should be the national poet. So some argued against Pushkin because Russians weren't familiar enough with them.
Right.
What else were the other arguments for and against?
Well, again, as I was saying, an aristocrat, kind of someone who led a frivolous life and wasn't very Christian, wasn't very pious, and died in a duel, a skirt chaser. I mean, there was always a religious argument against Pushkin. That was probably one of the last kind of obstacles to celebrating Pushkin. And just, we need a literature that's more responsive to the actual problems of Russian life. I mean, one of the tag phrases in the 60s debate was Pushkin or a pair of boots, or Shakespeare or a pair of boots, right? What's more useful? So this kind of utilitarian focus on literature, apart from its aesthetic values, right? There's kind of a downplaying of artistic worth in favor of political, ideological substance in writers. And Pushkin had become almost a symbol of aestheticism, of art for art's sake. Mm-hmm. Although that's a whole nother argument, probably unfair to Pushkin. It's very hard to nail Pushkin down as far as his position, right? I think he argued on many fronts and has many images in his work of what poetry is.
So why was it important for Russia to have a national poet? What was the reason? What was happening in other countries?
Okay, well, as a phenomenon in European culture and European history, being a national poet became a real sharp issue during Romanticism. I mean, I've looked at the kind of international span of national poets, and I counted up for myself 22 of them between 1750 and 1850. So it's a phenomenon that belongs to a particular time in European culture and European history. I think it's especially important, again, for Romanticism, right? The idea of poetry as divine, as reflecting, right, some kind of higher values, as embodying the nation and nationalism, right? Very important part of the whole romantic issue. And from the time that Pushkin was a beginning writer in the Lycée, people were looking to him as possibly the kind of the savior of Russian letters. Can I quote something for you from my book? This is Carlyle from his book on heroes and hero worship. He wrote this in 1840, which is 3 years after Pushkin died. The Tsar of all the Russians, he is strong, with so many bayonets, Cossacks, and cannons, and does a great feat in keeping such a tract of earth politically together. But he cannot yet speak. He is a great dumb monster hitherto. His cannons and Cossacks will all have rusted into nonentity, while that Dante's voice is still audible. The nation that has a Dante is bound together as no dumb Russia can be. So that gives you a little sense, right? Russians felt a pretty strong inferiority complex in the early 19th century. I mean, Chadaev is probably the most famous example of that, right? In his philosophical letters, talking about the nullity of Russian civilization. So there was definitely a European context. To have a poet, to have a national poet, is to say not only your language was viable for art, but that your nation had a voice. So having a literature, having a language was pretty crucial. I would say in the Slavic world in particular, but that's maybe another story.
Well, so then who were the voices speaking out for Pushkin?
Well, Pushkin, even though his reputation, as I said, kind of fell a little bit after he died, I think there'd always been kind of a cult around him. I mean, there's all the poets from his youth, idolized him. All the poets basically loved Pushkin. The older generation as well as the younger generation, the Karamzinians as well as the Shishkovites. I think Pushkin was such a talent that from his very earliest ages, people were recognizing him as the future promise of Russian letters. So I think that was part of Pushkin's self-image as well. He had this responsibility, in some sense, to represent Russianness and Russian literature. Part is reflected in just the wide spectrum of genres and types of poetry that he wrote: poetry and prose, love poetry, odes, ballads, etc. So there was a great expectation, I think, that Pushkin felt on his shoulders from the very beginning.
So if we can jump to the 20th century, late 20th century, in your research, did you ever encounter other Russian scholars who disagreed with the role that Pushkin played as the national poet, who thought maybe he didn't deserve that?
It's not a question of deserving, I think. I think it's a question of appreciating the complicated ways in which Pushkin's influence has grown and developed and become a phenomenon almost apart from Pushkin, even though people still are interested in Pushkin's actual influence. I mean, virtually any Russian poet through 2025 has to reckon with Pushkin. Like Shakespeare, right? His works have become part of the language. References to him, echoes of his poetry, it's everywhere. He's such a tremendous phenomenon, So it's not whether he deserves it, but how one is going to respond to it. How is one going to play with it? I think it's beyond doubt that Russians accept Pushkin as a great poet, as a genius, as a carrier of the national spirit. I think every single Russian from kindergarten on, maybe, right, is brought up with that tradition. So artists can struggle with that, certainly, but it's a creative struggle. It's not something that one can just say, oh, it's not worth dealing with, because it's omnipresent.
So was the issue decided before they eventually erected the monument to Pushkin in 1880? And talk to us about how that celebration came about to erect the monument.
Well, my book went back and looked at the nitty-gritty of how the monument was put together. A small group of people who are connected to the lycée, right, where Pushkin had gone in his youth, a very special education, and that tradition continued. But there was a core of kind of Pushkin cultists, people who really believed in him and loved him. And I think most Russian writers and poets in the 19th century, whatever the critics said, right, were fans of Pushkin. Dostoevsky's a good example, Gogol, Lermontov, right? So the cult of Pushkin never ceased to exist. But if we're talking about Pushkin's general national acceptance as national poet, that's kind of a different phenomenon. I think it depends on a lot of factors, including publications, the accessibility of Russians' writings, the reading public. The Russian, as I was saying before, national poet is a question not so much of texts and actual writings, but of social consciousness. Even though there have been some really good work on Pushkin's language, right, and how Pushkin was the creator of the Russian language. Now, obviously, that's conventional insofar as the Russian language had existed long before Pushkin. But the sense, I think, on the part of of society, that now we have our Shakespeare, now we have our Dante, right?
Right.
He validates the language and its ability to be an artistic medium, to be an aesthetic medium. It validates our worth as a people.
So then let's talk about the Pushkin statue on Pushkin Square now.
Okay.
And I'm showing the cover of your book, your first book, about that celebration in 1880. How did that come about?
Well, as I said, this small group of Pushkin cultists and the Society of Lovers of Russian Literature, which is a fairly unimportant peripheral literary group, they basically started a subscription. They started collecting money, and it took a very long time for them to raise enough money to create a monument, which is a pretty expensive undertaking. But it ended up as a kind of a unifying movement with the city of Moscow and the university and other literary societies. Plus, I think a major role in it was played by the newspapers. Right in the 70s, the wire services were established in connection with the Turkish War and so on. There was a sense of unity in the whole country that the Pushkin Jubilee played upon or benefited by. That is, all of the little disagreements and problems in organizing the celebration became major scandals and were kind of telegraphed across the country. And there was a lot of interest. Would this actually happen? Would it be successful? Would it break out into fistfights? One example of that is at one of the dinners during the celebration, Turgenev refused to clink glasses when they were making a toast with Mikhail Katkov, who was a very conservative newspaper editor, although earlier he had been very important in publishing the greats in his journals. But anyway, that was an example of one of the scandals of the Pushkin celebration that helped to magnify it into a really big national event. Turgenev being a liberal, unable to forgive Katkov for his many attacks on the Russian intelligentsia, and so on. Although Katkov himself was a famous proponent of Pushkin. So, but there were a lot of little crises, mini crises, that magnified attention to the Pushkin celebration. So by the time we get to Dostoevsky's speech, right, it was kind of the culmination, the acme of everything that had been said about Pushkin. I mean, if you're not familiar with that speech, he talks about Pushkin not only as a national poet, but as a international poet. That his genius was able to speak in all the tongues, right, of the Dishan national groups. That when Pushkin wrote about Spain, he wrote in the voice of Spanish, and when he wrote about English, he was able to kind of personify the English spirit and so on, and that Pushkin thus was a kind of integrating force for Russian culture. So yeah, kind of a grandiose vision that maybe was in tune with the great excitement of the holiday of opening this monument for all these various other reasons.
And that speech by Dostoevsky, I think that probably is what had the most impact, wouldn't you say, on the sort of the veneration of Pushkin and the
well, certainly the most lasting impact. I mean, it's still part of Russian cultural consciousness about Pushkin and about Dostoevsky. Although, maybe it was more Dostoevsky than Pushkin. Actually, right? It was more about cultural mythology.
Right.
He turned Pushkin into the kind of great reconciler, and somebody who also presented, from Dostoevsky's point of view, a call to the revolutionaries to turn away from European values towards Russianness, who he saw embodied in Pushkin, and especially in Tatyana from Eugene Onegin. Again, that had a long history in criticism. Famously in the 60s, Pisarev and Belinsky and some others were very unhappy that Tatyana turned Eugene Onegin down in favor of her marriage, which existed with this old and allegedly fat general, although that's not in Pushkin. It was kind of embroidered on, also through Tchaikovsky's opera, in which you saw Tatyana's husband on stage. Right, whereas in Evgeny Onegin, he's not there at all. But anyway, so there was this kind of reading Pushkin, especially Eugene Onegin, as a myth or a parable of Russian independence Russian values, of turning to religion, to the values of marriage and faithfulness, etc. The critics of Tatiana were, oh, she was just being faithful to the external trappings of religion rather than her heart, because she does admit that she still loves Onegin, but even so, she's unable to run off with him and to be unfaithful to her husband, and so on.
Those conservative values.
Right. But Dostoevsky read this into a kind of existential scenario for Russian culture, and specifically, again, addressing himself to the revolutionaries, saying, don't look to the West for your values, look to traditional Russian values.
We've talked about how many people, or the knowledge or the appreciation of Dostoevsky's speech is widespread, and Pushkin Square has become such a like a central part of Moscow. Everyone, and Pushkin is a central part of their life. Do people really understand the scope of the importance of that event? I'm showing here a postcard that I'm sure our audience has seen of Pushkin standing facing the monastery at the time when the celebration, when the monument was first erected. Other than that Pushkin speech, what is it that we can take away from Russia's experience with coming together around this national figure and erecting a monument privately outside of the government sphere to Pushkin?
Well, I believe one could write a book or two of responses to that. That is, it becomes a very powerful symbol of various things, including the independence of the poet, the independence of public opinion, the recognition of the values that Pushkin stands for, and a rejection maybe of some of the earlier attacks on Pushkin. I think a lot of things contributed to that. I think the statue by Opekusin is a wonderful statue that shows Pushkin a very meditative kind of a state. It's not that upbeat, but it also is kind of a spur to meditation and contemplation. The pedestal in which Pushkin's famous poem called A Monument, right, which is a variation on Horace's, right, Exegi Monumentum. It's taken as Pushkin's real statement as a national figure, as a national poet. So it's a kind of literalization of the idea, right? For Horace, and in the poem, right, the monument is a monument not built by hands, right? It's his language, it's his words are his monument. So it's a kind of literalization of the metaphor, right? We see that in the Slavic world time and again, right? Toppling statues, erecting statues, right? When you have a revolution or a war, right? You go around toppling statues and putting up new ones as a symbol of cultural allegiance. So a very powerful symbolic action. I won't say the Pushkin monument was the first, but I think it's a very dramatic realization of that metaphor.
So you write that. So at that time of the Pushkin celebration, there were lots of publications, there were beautiful albums that were being published, and you wrote that there was a lot of hope and expectation that that this event would go down in history, but events overtook it. The assassination of Alexander II, and that this event and this whole piece of history became a footnote and was not remembered. Is that the case? I mean, what does that mean that it became a footnote of history? That people did all of that just sort of go away and it just was not important anymore?
No, I think it just changed. I mean, as far as the publication boom, that was 7 years later. Right? Pushkin's wife had petitioned and gotten the copyright on Pushkin works to be extended from 1862, another 25 years to 1887. And at the time of the Pushkin celebration, one critic said it's a total shame that with all this attention to Pushkin, one can't find Pushkin in the bookstores, that there are very few publications of Pushkin. Well, when the copyright ended, there was an absolute explosion. I could cite statistics in the millions. So it went from, the low tens of thousands in the whole period since Pushkin had died to multi-millions. So it became a major industry, publishing Pushkin. So it's taking advantage of the emancipation, right? The whole Russian peasantry, which was on the verge of becoming literate. So there were publications for school children, publications for soldiers, publications for high school students, and so on, plus many full editions. Right, so it's a time when incredible attention toward Pushkin's texts, right, and certainly those people that I talked about before, those cultists, right, who became known as Pushkinisti, which still exist, right, a class of scholars who work on Pushkin's life and works in publishing, right, that became a central academic industry. Right, Pushkin played the same role as Shakespeare, right, in English literary studies, or Goethe in German. So we have a whole new branches of interest in Pushkin: academic, then educational, right? In the schools, Pushkin became a pretty basic part of the school curriculum, and so on. And we haven't even talked here about Pushkin in opera, Pushkin in drama, Pushkin on the stage, Pushkin in folk songs. All right, all of these areas cumulatively, kept Pushkin around. Just because Alexander II was assassinated, right? It maybe put to bed the idea that there was going to be a real reconciliation, right, between Russian society and the state, because Alexander III was very conservative, right? A whole series of repressive measures against the state, against society, against publishing. But at the same time, I think the state as well as the church were recognizing the popularity of Pushkin. So they were also getting in on the boom in Pushkin and Pushkin studies.
Right. And you're right, and they kept celebrating him. 1899, the 100th anniversary.
Right. Yeah, in the 1899 Jubilee, which was sponsored by the official institutions, by the government, by the Pushkinisti, by the publishers, that was a tremendous celebration that took place all over the Russian Empire. In contrast to 1880, which was seen as a holiday of the intelligentsia, right? Because the cream of Russian intellectuals, almost everybody of note, apart from Tolstoy, who's the outlier, came to Moscow for this celebration. Turgenev, Dostoevsky, etc., Tchaikovsky, right? In 1899, the intelligentsia was very skeptical. Right, they didn't like the fact that the state was co-opting Pushkin into this very official kind of a figure to feed to the masses. So by that time, there was really some real opposition to the celebration about Pushkin. It wasn't really about Pushkin per se, right? It was about the manipulation of Pushkin's image by the state. The state, for example, downplayed Pushkin's connection to the Decembrists. It became a very sensitive issue. But when some scholars kind of made the case that Pushkin really was sympathetic to the Decembrists, they were persecuted. They were even exiled. Their books were censored and so on. So the political issues of publishing Pushkin continued, right, which had been an issue since Pushkin's life, right, when the Tsar's censorship did not let some of Pushkin's greatest works be published. In fact, the poem on the pedestal, the monument poem, was originally carved on the pedestal in the censored version, which I believe Zhukovsky had rewritten for the censor, and so on. So the problem of who has the right to represent Pushkin, what are Pushkin's real values? But certainly that tradition of looking at Pushkin as a pro-Decembrist made him was one of the things that made Pushkin palatable in the Soviet period, right? Even though there was definitely a movement against all of Tsarist culture, they were able to eventually recoup Pushkin as a fighter for liberty, which wasn't too hard to do.
Right. That's the great thing about Pushkin. He
Yeah.
worked with all different, belief systems, all different points of view, audiences. In your study of other national poets, and where does Pushkin fall, or where does Russia fall within the way they embrace their national poet and use their national poet? Because there were all of the special anniversaries. There was the use of Pushkin's works to increase literacy across the entire Russian Empire, Soviet Union. Do the other national poets get as much attention from their people and their governments?
It's a good question. I think it's analogous. I'm not sure if they're equal. It's a complicated question because I think each national tradition has its own flavor. Which are the works that embody the national spirit. First, Hans Christian Andersen, who wrote fairy tales, or other writers that wrote in other genres. I think that's part of it. But I don't know whether one can quantify a national love for one's heroes in that kind of a way. Certainly, yeah.
The use of Pushkin is just so broad.
Well, that's right, and so extensive even till today. Pushkin museums, places where Pushkin lived, pilgrimages to places associated with Pushkin's name, etc. It's really a national sport. Someone compared him to Elvis in the United States, right? As still a figure of pop culture and adoration and so on. I think we'd have to go into great detail to look at some of the other national traditions. But the idea of the national poet is that their greatness and the greatness of their works is a stand-in for the value of the national language and for the nation itself. And I would say in the Slavic world, when you have a lot of different nationalities, right, claiming the same land, having a national poet, and it means having a language, which means having a state, having the right to political independence, was very important in Eastern and Central Europe, I would say. There's even one national poet. What was his name? Andrei Zorin wrote about this. Who's a national poet who's claimed by 3 different Slavic languages. I think his name is Piotr Njegoš. Excuse me if I'm getting this wrong, but claimed by the Serbs and by the Montenegrins and maybe by the Croatians. So, right, when you get into national politics, it becomes a little sticky in some cases.
Sure. So I have on screen this portrait of Alexander Sumarokov. You're doing research on him. I want to talk about that. And what's interesting is, if we jump back before Pushkin into the 18th century, there has been some discussion that perhaps Sumarokov is the father of Russian literature. And Pushkin himself had some views on that. Can you tell us who was Sumarokov and why is he so unknown?
Well, I think he's unknown both because in the early 19th century, Russian culture kind of went through a real crisis of self-image, and the whole 18th century tradition was downplayed, denigrated as being reactionary, and literature was felt to be just a tool of the government. The more, maybe you can think other reasons. I don't think he was nearly the genius of Pushkin. Of course, he lived in a period when there was no Russian literature, right? He was one of the handful of writers, together with Lomonosov and Tredyakovsky, who were creating a Russian literature in Russian, in the vernacular, right? The earlier literary tradition had been a Russified Slavonic. I would say Sumarokov was kind of a Pushkin wannabe. He thought of himself, I think, in those kind of terms, as the progenitor or the father of Russian letters. Just a few things. I made a list of some of his great moments. He went to a special school for noblemen, the Kadetsky Korpus, whereas Pushkin went to the Lycée. He saw himself as a professional writer, right? As opposed to his other contemporaries, who were either professors or Lomonosov was a chemist and so on. But he saw himself as, right, professional writer. Like Pushkin, he made an effort to leave examples of a whole series of genres of writings, different kinds of poetry. He wrote the first comedies and tragedies of a modern type. He founded the Russian theater. He wrote and published the first Russian literary journal, kind of a one-man journal, although published other materials as well. Like Pushkin, he navigated some of the same problems. That is the problem of the patronage system and relationship to the court. Right, he had a kind of a rocky relationship with Catherine the Great, and so on. So I think, right, there are a lot of things that draw them together. On the other hand, right, there wasn't really literary criticism, right, which played such an important part in 19th century Russian culture, starting with Belinsky, right, who was a great canonizer of what we know as the classics of Russian literature. So no criticism, very little reading public, right, even though Sumarokov, who had the right to publish his works at government cost, that was one of the things that Catherine the Great granted to him. So he made great use of that. He published lots of books, lots of material. So he was also kind of a model writer from the point of view of the publishing industry, right? Novikov, who was a famous publisher in the later 18th century, published a full works of Pushkin after he died. That was the first one. So the model of publishing, for all its weaknesses. He also suffered a decline after his death. I think there was changes in the literary scene from kind of high classicism, which Sumarokov is said to embody, to sentimentalism, etc. But I think I could go on. I think there are more ways in which Sumarokov was a very central figure in 18th century literary life. And that's why my colleagues at the Pushkinsky Dom and I set out to publish a full critical works. I'm happy to say that the first volume has already been typeset. It just remains to be proofread. So I'm awaiting any day to see that first volume, in which I have a few of his works represented. But one can,
you have Russian collaborators on that as well, right? Yes,
there's a very famous section of scholars on 18th century Russia at the Pushkinsky Dom in Petersburg. Mm-hmm. Again, it's also a museum of Pushkin, mm-hmm. The Pushkin House. What else can I say? I mean, the Pushkin House was established in the early 20th century as kind of Petersburg's answer to the Pushkin Monument in Moscow. Uh-huh. Right, so the Pushkinsky Dom was to be Petersburg claim on Pushkin. And obviously, Petersburg had a lot more connections with Pushkin in his life than Moscow, even though Pushkin was born in Moscow. But anyway, so my colleagues, I think, I was very pleased that they chose to put their energy into publishing Sumarokov. But I think that anybody who wants to study 18th century Russian literature seriously has to deal with Sumarokov. He had his finger in so many different literary pies. He really had his, right, he was on the pulse of literature of his age. One of my undergraduate professors said that there are two kinds of great writers. Ones that are great for all time, kind of geniuses that transcend their age, and those that are great in their own day. and certainly Sumarokov clearly belongs to the latter category. One can't expect, the first attempt to write in the vernacular Russian, which didn't exist, right, as a literary language, to be as perfect, right, and consciously modeled, as a later one. I mean, Pushkin, in a way, was the culmination of the whole 18th century tradition, something I think that's still underplayed in scholarship. Pushkin had an amazing memory for literature. He was very much the inheritor of the entire 18th century tradition of literature. Not only Derzhavin, who came at the very end of the tradition and was probably Pushkin's most important forerunner in Russian literature. So the issue of why Pushkin said such nasty things about Sumarokov. He didn't only, if you read carefully, there are some places in which he says some nice things about him, like saying that he wrote much better than Tretyakovsky, for example. There's a late German scholar named Helene Immendorfer who wrote an article talking about using the anxiety of influence, the idea of Harold Bloom, that Pushkin was a rival, felt that Sumarokov was a rival, and so he had to negate him or ignore him or downplay him, etc. And I think there's some truth to that. Pushkin in general was not a kind of jealous writer, right? Who was against borrowing or against influence. But in this case, I think maybe she has a case. That Sumarokov, as a precursor, was some kind of a threat.
A threat
to Pushkin, maybe.
So in Pushkin's time, people were familiar enough with Sumarokov's works, and
that's right.
He was still there on the scene.
It was really, in the teens and 20s that the whole 18th century tradition began to be considered false literature, pseudo-literatura. Mm-hmm. Right, that classicism was nothing and romanticism was everything. So kind of an exaggerated view of the 18th century as classicism in the bad sense. I think of the image of Salieri in Pushkin's Mozart and Salieri, where Mozart is the genius for whom inspiration comes, right? And he's very lighthearted and easy, and right, where Salieri is the one who follows all the rules, right? Right, it says he anatomized music like a corpse, and so on. So I think that was going on. That is, the 18th century with Sumarokov as one of its great representatives was being completely downplayed in favor of romanticism, and Pushkin here was the great romantic poet. Although, by the way, in the second half of Pushkin's career, he had a lot of trouble overcoming that reputation. That is, a lot of his later works, his mature works, were already moving away from romanticism towards, again, his mature creativity, that are very hard to pigeonhole with a label like romanticism.
Right.
But Pushkin was the one who was able to kind of cross the lines between high and low literature, right? Between the very high kind of neoclassical literature of, say, Lomonosov, right, who is Sumarokov's rival and contemporary, and on the other hand, the vernacular. Again, Sumarokov tried to do that within the framework of genres. That is, some of the low genres, Sumarokov used the vernacular freely in his comedies or his fables, for example. But Pushkin was able to move from one to the other. So in a way, he was the great synthesizer.
He was the synthesizer. Does that make him the first and the father?
Well, that's a social construct. I mean, that's the view of Pushkin that has been accepted by Russian society. Mm-hmm. There's Pushkin, the romantic revolutionary who started things from zero. So as I was saying before, the whole 18th century tradition which was very much incorporated into Pushkin,
Right.
kind of under the table, not really emphasized, was ignored. So, one of the things I've been doing has been trying to uncover some of those important roots of Pushkin's artistry in the 18th century. And the thing I focused on recently in my work on Yevgeny Onegin is its roots in the burlesque, which was a very lively genre in the 18th century and in 18th century Russia. It was interesting because the mock epic tradition of the burlesque existed without epics, as there weren't really any successful epics, even though that was considered the height of literary value. I mean, there are a few by Kheraskov which in their time were considered great works, which by the 19th century had become completely forgotten and archaic. But the burlesque was very, very much alive, and I would say some of the best poetry in the 18th century is in the burlesque mode, by Maikov, by Bogdanovich. These are poets that Pushkin knew by heart and knew very well, right? And he's citing them in Eugene Onegin and his other poetry. There's also obscene verse of the 18th century, which is extremely funny, right? Which again is in that mock burlesque mode. Pushkin,
an example of Pushkin not necessarily being first, but him maybe doing it in the best or in a new way. But there are the precursors from the previous century that came into play.
That's right. And Pushkin was such a great writer. I think we feel it, on our first acquaintance with any poem that he wrote. There's just something so perfect, so balanced. I don't know. Maybe this is just a personal response, but I think most people have this response as well, that there's something so beautiful about his language.
We have a few questions as we wrap up. One about Pushkin. Communists in the Soviet Union and current authorities count Pushkin as Russian national legacy. While studying his works, poems, prose, notes, did you find Pushkin's admiration of Russia as an empire?
Well, it's a complicated question, and there's been a lot written on it, especially since the recent events in Ukraine, because Russian literature has been, looked at from the eyes of the colonized peoples of the empire, and certainly Russia had not a wonderful record, right, in suppressing Ukrainian, etc., in the 19th century. As far as Pushkin, it's a complicated story that I can't say in just a few words. I mean, he wrote some fairly famous, very patriotic works, supporting, for example, the suppression of the Polish rebellion in 1830, and some other patriotic works. And Pushkin was not only a kind of precursor of the rebels and the intelligentsia as oppositionist, but I think he also thought of himself, again, in the 18th century style, as a representative of the nation, if not of the government. So I think his politics, went from being very liberal in his earlier years to, I think, much more restrained under Nicholas I, who was very repressive, as you know. So there are different opinions. I mean, Pushkin was very the opposite of racist. That is, he embraced many different national groups and religions in his poetry. He wrote imitations of the Quran. He wrote some, clearly Russian Orthodox themed poems. So you can cherry pick and create a Pushkin of your choice. Again, he lived in a complicated period, from the liberalism of the early years of Alexander I. He was a teenager during the Napoleonic invasion. Then the Decembrist Revolt in 1825, a lot of his good friends were involved in that. A couple were hung, for their participation. He himself was exiled right, in 1821. So there's a lot of stuff going on. But there's definitely a thread in Pushkin's career and works of representing Russia, and not just as a revolutionary, but as supporting kind of the national greatness. His works on Peter the Great, like Bronze Horseman, was beautiful. So I'm not going to give a complete answer to that one.
We don't have time for that. Someone else did ask, do you have favorite Pushkin works or favorite quotes from Pushkin's works?
Well, I'm always drawn back to Eugene Onegin. I think it's endlessly deep. And I've written on it from various different perspectives. Again, individual poems of his are just gorgeous. Some of his love poetry, his poem to Chadaev, which is very patriotic, but anti-czarist, and so on. It's hard to say. As a professor of literature, I deal with such wonderful works all the time. It's hard to choose one over another.
The last question is asking you to choose one American poet over another. So, not unexpected, this question: what poet writer can be called America's national hero, whose heritage is everywhere, like Shakespeare or Pushkin?
It's a good question for us. It's a trick question. I mean, I think the ones that I would choose probably fall out of that heyday of 1750 to 1850. Someone like Mark Twain or Walt Whitman. They're a little bit later, and I think their position in the national psyche is less like Shakespeare. Yeah. I mean, there are others. Hawthorne, Melville, from the earlier 19th century, are very much in tune, right, with some of the Russian writers of that period, like Gogol. There's the more romantic writers. I guess I'm drawn more to the earlier ones, but not in terms of national poet. Although certainly American literature was also trying to assert its independence from English literature. So that was definitely on their minds.
But I don't think any of our poets broke through like Pushkin.
I can't think of anyone who's really comparable. But it might be that because literature in Russia was elevated to such a high pedestal, which is not really the case in the United States. I mean, it was as if literature in Russia and the Slavic lands represented a right to exist in some kind of existential terms. I think there's definitely a movement towards American independence, but I don't think it was in the same kind of extreme terms, for better or for worse. I mean, the Russians in general go overboard, right? In cases like that, in cultural matters, they want to take things to its ultimate kind of extreme. I don't know. Maybe Mark Twain.
I would guess Mark Twain too.
Who feels very contemporary, although he's not a poet. But I would say that some of the national poets that are on my list are not really poets.
Right.
I mentioned Hans Christian Andersen, right, who wrote in prose, I believe. I don't know whether he wrote any poetry at all. Or someone like Cervantes, who did write some poetry, but it's not great poetry, right? But he's really famous for his novel, for Don Quixote. Cervantes is certainly one of the precursors, right? He's not on my list of 22, but I have a short list of precursors, starting with Homer, right, which was clearly kind of the national poet, if you will, of Greece, kind of the foundation of the Greek educational system, where everybody knew him by heart. But then Camões in Portugal, and Cervantes, and Shakespeare. And certainly Shakespeare was a great model for the 19th century Europe. And the Shakespeare Jubilee that Garrick organized in 1769, right, had a real international resonance. for all of those European national poets. They were all emulating Shakespeare and the Shakespeare Jubilee and putting up monuments. Right? There's a very rich literature of that.
That
Shakespeare called
the Pushkin monument, Pushkin Jubilee.
Absolutely, no question. The very idea of putting up a monument to a writer, which was also somewhat revolutionary, right? Before that, well, you put up monuments to czars or to generals.
Right.
It wasn't a usual thing to put up monuments to people of culture. But Shakespeare was the exception. And there was a whole body of literature also associated with the Shakespeare Jubilee. There were poems written to him, etc. It had a real international resonance. And there was a Dante and Goethe Jubilees and so on. That's all the context, right? The larger context for what was going on in Russia.
Great. Marcus, thank you so much. This was fascinating and interesting and educational.
Well, time really flew. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Good. Okay.